Dzień dobry, witam Państwa. Dzisiaj mamy przyjemność gościć w kanale sobieskim wyjątkową osobę, wyjątkowego gościa, panią ambasador N.Rao, która przez wiele lat była czołową przedstawicielką indyjskiej służby zagranicznej, również szefem służby zagranicznej, jak również ambasadorem w Stanach Zjednoczonych i w Chińskiej Republice Ludowej. Ambassador Rao, it's a pleasure to have you in Kanał Sobieski. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Rafal. I'm very happy to be here and to engage in this conversation with you today.
Fantastic. Maybe I already kind of mentioned it in Polish, but let me briefly acquaint and introduce our viewers to yourself and to your career. As I mentioned, you are a former Indian Foreign Service officer. You retired as Foreign Secretary to the government of India, and we'll speak in a bit about what exactly Foreign Secretary in an Indian administration does. You were the second woman to occupy that post between 2009 and 2011. Prior to that, you were the first woman spokesperson of the Indian Foreign Office. You also served as the first woman High Commissioner, ambassador to Sri Lanka between 2004 and 2006, and the People's Republic of China, which I'm sure we'll speak about a lot during this conversation. That was between years 2006 and 2009. You also were Indian ambassador to the United States between 2011 and 2013, which gives you this unique perspective of having had that experience of serving in both what are now the two global powers that all conversations, when we're talking about geopolitics, foreign relations, economy, trade, revolve around. But surely what we would like to also touch upon during this conversation is India's role in this new geopolitical order that we are witnessing forming at this stage. Following your retirement, you were a senior visiting fellow international public affairs at Brown University. You also taught at Columbia University School of International Public Affairs, and you are also a global fellow at Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. So an illustrious career as a public servant, as a foreign service officer. You also wrote a fantastic book, which I highly recommend, Fractured Himalaya, about the relationship between India and China in the Tibet region, culminating in the war of 1962, and how this informs the relations today. So much so for introduction. As I said, we are really privileged to have you here with us. What I would like to ask you first, talking about foreign service and the differences between European system of diplomacy and Indian. What exactly does a foreign secretary do, and how does your role at the time, how did it fit into the wider foreign service of India?
Well, to put it succinctly, the foreign secretary is the top career diplomat in India's Ministry of External Affairs. And we are not political appointees. Unlike a political appointee, the foreign secretary emerges from decades of service in the Indian Foreign Service, which is India's diplomatic service. And often that individual could have served in the most sensitive, complex, and strategic areas and held such portfolios. So the role entails not just policy formulation, but advising the political leadership, managing crises, overseeing India's diplomatic missions across the globe, and shaping long-term diplomatic strategy. So as Foreign Secretary, I dealt, as you mentioned in your introduction, I dealt with India's relations with our neighbors like China, Pakistan, Sri Lanka during critical periods, and helped articulate India's response to major global developments while also focusing on institutional reform, on economic and cultural diplomacy and mentorship, especially for women in the Foreign Service.
And on that last point, we're definitely going to come back to that issue of women in power and women leadership. But I think what comes out very clearly from your answer is that in Indian Foreign Service, there is a certain degree of continuity because of the fact that Foreign Service officials are non-partisan and essentially work with whichever party happens to be in power in India. And as we all know, India being the biggest democracy in the world. And that continuity is something definitely I like to discuss. But I think what would really be interesting to our viewers here, and that clearly that perspective and that stance has been informed by decades of policy formulation and advising and managing crises, as you just said. I would like to refer, what I'm talking about, I'd like to refer to your article in Foreign Affairs in 2023, where you spoke about India's great power opportunity in the context of Russia's full-scale invasion against Ukraine in 2022. Clearly, in the Western press at least, India has received quite a bit of criticism, particularly from the US, regarding its stance and its unwillingness to sideline and in a way act in a similar way to the West against Russia. And in your article, you outlined why that's the case. Would you like to kind of elaborate on that in the context of what many people, and I would say vast majority of Polish people, perceive as an invasion that in no sense was warranted and was targeted against a country that wasn't a threat to the Russian Federation?
Well, it's not that in any way that we have endorsed or stood behind Russia's decision to enter into military conflict with the Ukraine. I would like to preface my response with that foundational statement. Our position, as I explained in my article in Foreign Affairs, is rooted in our strategic autonomy, and our decisions, as decisions made by Poland or any other sovereign country would be, are guided by our national interest and not by alignment or support of any particular country. Our defense partnership, particularly with Russia, is very long-standing and critical. Let me underline that, critical for our continental security, especially given the evolving China challenge, which we'll speak about, no doubt. But at the same time, we are committed to international law and have consistently called for diplomacy and dialogue. You know, Prime Minister Modi has been both in Russia and the Ukraine, underscoring the importance of dialogue. And as Mr. Modi stated to President Putin, this is not the era of war, to quote him exactly. So our neutrality, if you can term it as such for want of a better word, is not indifference. It is, as we see it, the exercise of mature statecraft in a very complex geopolitical environment and in the context of where India is situated geopolitically.
No, understood. I think that strategic autonomy and neutrality, in a sense, has been the highlight of Indian foreign policy for decades. Post-independence in 1947, Prime Minister Nehru policy at the time was one of non-alignment. And that kind of continued, let's say, until the 60s. To a certain extent, though, there was a turning point, and you obviously are an expert in that field, with the 1962 war that India fought against China. And the fact that following that, US's opening to China under the Nixon-Kissinger policy kind of steered India towards further soft alignment with the Soviet Union. Is that something that obviously is still evolving in terms of non-alignment to multipolar strategic autonomy. But why, looking at the historical references and historical experiences, why would you say 1962 war against China was such a pivotal moment in India's foreign policy and its policy formulation and its relations, not only with China, but with the wider world?
Well, let me explain that our non-alignment, as it was called in the early stage of our evolution in the 1950s, was never isolationism. If you look at the Nehruvian approach to the world, the grand strategy, as it were, of Mr. Nehru, he saw it as strategic autonomy, even as we do today, in a very deeply polarized and divided world. And, you know, we can describe the current global situation in terms that point to its deep polarization. Now, the 1962 China-India conflict that you referred to was definitely a sobering moment, a kind of hinge moment. And it revealed the limits of, if you can say, idealism or a certain, perhaps, you know, innocence, let us say, at that stage about dealing with the rest of the world. It underscored the need for credible deterrence and realpolitik. And from then on, India began edging towards what we might call, you mentioned soft alignment, a more pragmatic engagement with the erstwhile Soviet Union. So the 1971 Treaty of Peace, Friendship, and Cooperation with the USSR marked that pivot, the pivot that you spoke of. It was a necessary recalibration, not an ideological betrayal of what we then saw as non-alignment. So, I hope that explains the situation.
And in that context of the 1962 war, you know, there are many books written about it, and your book, by the way, is fantastic, and I highly recommend it to our viewers. It was referred to in another very popular foreign policy expert, Henry Kissinger, in his book on China. He actually starts the book with talking about that 1962 conflict, transformational conflict, by referring to the Chinese attitudes towards dealing with that situation through reference to ancient Chinese thought on statecraft, on managing crises. And I think, and we'll go a bit into kind of soft power and that element of it in terms of narratives, in terms of compelling storytelling. But I think one of the successful things that China has done in the last few decades is infuse the Western debate with certain reverence for their civilization and their thought that is continuous for thousands of years and has huge tradition of how to manage the state, the country, manage the relations between states, and how to essentially grow one's position in a wider framework and a wider environment. In the context of India, I think that kind of appreciation of this continuity of an ancient civilization is not appreciated to the same extent. But what I wanted to refer to, and it's been a kind of a book that has been referred to in other publications, including Shiv Shankar Menon, who was also foreign secretary, who mentioned that India's mindset is materially different to the Western international borders, which is based on Westphalian mindset or Westphalian state and ideas of sovereignty and legitimacy. And in that context, a lot is kind of spoken about or referred to is the book of Kautilya, the Artha Shastra, and how that informs Indian policymaking today, perhaps to the same extent as what Kissinger was referring to in his book. I just wanted to ask about, from your perspective, is that something that is present in terms of this policy formulation and the mindset that Shiv Shankar Menon was talking about and other scholars are referring to?
Well, you referred to Mao's invocation of Chinese history, the Tang era particularly, in the context of the China-India conflict, and that's quite fascinating. There's no doubt about it, and it reflects how China views history as a strategic resource, and that's I think that's a place marker. We have to keep that in mind. And for India, you talked about it too. The equivalence would be Kautilya's Arthashastra. And this is a study, a treatise which foregrounds statecraft, realpolitik, and the balance of power. But unlike China, India's policy making has, I would say, over the years, not drawn so frequently on its classical traditions. That's changing now. That is certainly transitioning now. And we'll see how the situation evolves as we kind of use these precepts to suggest more insights into our strategic behavior and also to operationalize some of these concepts in a modern geopolitical context. So I think Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon is right. India's worldview has been somewhat different from, and here we get into the European Westphalian model, because our civilizational ethos has been, as a country where we're situated, continental and maritime, has been layered and multidimensional. So, and what happened was, through recent history over the last few centuries, our encounter with British colonialism imposed Western Westphalian norms of sovereignty upon us. But that is not our native paradigm, may I say that. Perhaps the Buddhist mandala, a cartography of influence, and here geopolitics does come in, a cartography of influence built on concentric circles of engagement rather than fixed borders. I'm not saying we're abandoning Westphalian notions of sovereignty, but I'm hearkening to tradition. And perhaps that traditionally is illustrative of how we saw the world. But today it's a very different situation, of course. We are positioned, however, as a very living civilizational core, drawing not only on the memory of colonialism, but refusing to be boxed into rigid ideological camps. And this carries contradictions, you know very well, but it also has its strengths.
Absolutely, that's a very interesting perspective. In the context of post-independence policy making and priorities, really, there are some who say that chief aim, and I think many people will agree with that, of Indian statecraft was transformation of the country into a prosperous, strong, modern economy, with the help of the international order that was set up by the West post World War II, in terms of trade, in terms of economic development and economic interactions between states. And certain scholars would argue that India, given where it is now, has been one of the biggest beneficiary of this rules-based international order and globalization that was led by the US and the West. On the other hand, some scholars would say that, in fact, Bretton Woods, if we give a name to that particular order, was designed to keep, and I think this is a phrase used by Jay Shankar, the Minister of External Affairs, keep India in play and yet also keep it in check. And those rules that were set up served the West very well while diminishing its competition. So, in other words, there was a certain straitjacket that was imposed on India, and the West was happy for it to rise up to a certain point, but not to threaten the kind of distribution of power within that order. Which of those perspectives would you say is perhaps closer to your view?
Both those perspectives, in my estimation, hold some truth. You can't reject either of them. We did benefit as a country from a relatively open global system, particularly in trade and technology. There's no doubt about it. And that was a very important constituent and input into our process of modernization and development. But as you talked about Dr. Jaishankar, our present foreign minister, as he has noted, many of the Bretton Woods rules were not really tuned to or designed with India's rise in mind. And they often privilege incumbents. And when I say incumbents, I refer mainly to the West, if I may. Our challenge, therefore, as developing countries, as countries in the global South, and particularly India as one of the largest economies in the world and a very well-functioning, viable, vibrant democracy, is to reform global governance today so that it reflects contemporary realities, not the contours just of the post-1945 World War II world order. Therefore, when we talk of multipolarity, shared prosperity, equality, sovereign equality, we're not rejecting the global order. You spoke of how India played by the rules, believes as an article of faith in a rules-based international order. We are not rejecting the global order. We're not disruptors. But we would like definitely the status quo to be amended, to be reformed, and rebalanced in every sense of the word.
No, that's a very, very good point. And I think what and you spoke about it in your article in the Foreign Affairs, is this is the opportunity. And the reason for that is that, as we've seen definitely since the start of the second Trump administration, a certain unraveling of that order, or the balance of power within that order shifting. And that unipolar moment that definitely many people have been speaking about in 1990s and through the early noughties and the early part of the 21st century, it seems to have had its served its time, shall we say. And within that context, that willingness to India an Indian foreign policy to, as you say, reform the status quo is quite timely and has the kind of environment for it to actually, to a certain extent, succeed. But
Absolutely right.
But clearly, there is a certain wrinkle here, right? Which is the fact that there is another player, which we already referred to, that wishes for that global order to be disrupted, to a certain extent, although I'm talking about People's Republic of China, are the great beneficiary of globalization as well. And there is a sense that we might be moving towards, at least in the Asia Pacific, because that's definitely what's most important from India's perspective, is a kind of globalization or regionalization with a China-centric hierarchical order, a unipolar Asia, if you like. What do you think, given that framing and that development now and we're talking specifically about Asia Pacific, India's response should be a kind of a balancing act steeped in a multi-aligned formula where India aligns itself with other players within Southeast Asia and South Asia? Or do you see, unfortunately, a bit more confrontational development kind of taking hold because of events progressing at a great speed? And we obviously seen it in Ladakh in 2020, the altercation on the line of control, actual control in the Himalayas between Chinese and Indian border soldiers, effectively.
Right. So have you finished?
Yeah. So I'm wondering what, in your sense, would be the best way forward in this context. The old order is unraveling, and we now have new status quo forming.
Right. So speaking of India's grand strategy, if I may, I think it's shaped by three imperatives today. One, of course, is strategic autonomy. We spoke about it. Then, of course, there is India's regional policy, India in South Asia, our neighborhood imperatives. And, we're a dominant country in the region, as you know, but this neighborhood policy is extremely sensitive and has to be constantly worked on. And we have another, elephant in the room as far as the region is concerned, that's China. And of course, we're talking of seeking more global influence to become a leading power, as Dr. Jaishankar has often stated. So we're moving, or at least we would like to move to a situation of multipolarity. Our positions are multi-aligned, omnidirectional, and we engage across blocks without becoming subordinate to anyone. Therefore, we're not non-aligned in the old sense. We're not aligned in a Cold War sense. We pursue our interests. We don't express any ideological affiliations. And in the Indo-Pacific, it's a question of shaping norms, of deterring coercion. Deterring coercion is very important. And I think every country in the Indo-Pacific, I'm not talking of China in that context or the United States, we'll set them aside for the moment, but every other country would like to see, norms shaped in a way that the region remains stable, undisturbed, and coercion does not define the politics of relations between countries. So we work with like-minded partners. You spoke about what our approach would be. We work with like-minded partners, for instance, with frameworks like the Quad, with the United States, with Japan, with Australia. And of course, our policy towards the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, our maritime influence in the Indian Ocean, our positions on that subject with the island states, towards Africa, towards the Gulf region. So we would like to shape a free and open and rules-based order. And as I wrote in the Wilson Quarterly recently, China's gray zone tactics do threaten regional balance here, and we have to deter where necessary, but we also cooperate pragmatically with China where our interests are concerned.
No, absolutely. Although I would like to kind of drill down on one issue, because you mentioned the Quad, which is an alliance. Well, it's not really an alliance, a coalition, right, in terms of security between.
It's not a platform, I would say. It's a platform to shape norms and deter coercion. And yes, that's
correct.
true.
But at the same time, and correct me if I'm wrong, from the Chinese perspective, it's viewed as yet another element of closer, and we can use the term from the Cold War, soft alignment that I referred to in relation to USSR before, but definitely a coming together between India and US, and therefore, from Chinese perspective, perhaps that's viewed in a way as a coalition that would threaten the Chinese ability to exercise power and project power in the Indo-Pacific and in Asia Pacific. And in that context, you mentioned also the Wilson Quarterly article. You advocated in a way in that article for greater US participation in the region. So isn't there a bit of a contradiction of, on the one hand, saying, yes, you want to deter coercion and want to have a multi-aligned strategy that works across blocks, but at the same time, that's not how it's viewed in China. It's rather viewed as further evidence of India bringing US further into what they might perceive as their sphere of influence.
And I don't think any country should practice a strategy that seeks domination or hegemony in the region. And that has been India's response and India's position, India's approach, and India's policy throughout. There's been no change in that, regardless of what administration is in power in New Delhi. The article you referred to that I wrote in the Wilson Quarterly was a kind of letter to the new Trump administration. It was just before the inauguration of Mr. Donald Trump, to speak about the importance of the Indo-Pacific and the need for the United States to continue its presence there, its involvement, its relationships. It's worked certainly for the good of many countries in the region. Of course, there is a very tangled history of American involvement in the region from the Cold War onwards, but I'm talking of the present. And when I'm talking of the present, I'm talking of the need for balance and the need for cooperation and coexistence, if I may use that word, among all countries in the region. And the United States has been a presence here, has been an Indo-Pacific power for many decades now. And there's no reason why that connection should be terminated in any way. I think that was the burden of my argument in that article.
No, that's true. We also want to refer to your book, The Fractured Himalaya, where in the introduction, you kind of end the introduction by saying that this closer alignment between India and the US provides a certain equilibrium to the region and is able, through the coalition also of smaller states, coalesced around what I would say India and US to withstand that coercion, deter the coercion from the People's Republic of China. Does it mean, therefore, that in order for that equilibrium hold, it is necessary for the US presence and influence in the Asia-Pacific region?
Well, I think you have to be very clear-eyed about this, and India definitely intends to be clear-eyed. This is not Cold War redux. I must emphasize that. It's not like, we're aligning with one country or we're joining one bloc or we are pinning our colors to a different mast. It's not that. I think we would like a very balanced, stable equilibrium in the Indo-Pacific because many of us, countries of the global south in this part of the world. We want rapid economic development. We want the best for our people. We have, such a large proportion of young people in India. We could talk about that later in the interview. So this is a very fluid situation we are dealing with. And there are many economic priorities to be taken care of. And if you see war and conflict and military tension and arms build-ups intervening, then it takes away really from the prospects for economic development and the stability of the region. So that really is what India is talking about. Now, where India and China are concerned, and I think that's important because, we have to talk about the neighborhood in foreign policy. That becomes the first priority. So I've always advocated, and I say that in the Fractured Himalaya also, that India and China must coexist given our geography, given the compulsions of economics and development, and given our civilizational backgrounds and our cooperation multilaterally and in the global south, despite, let me say, the great gulf and the divisions that populate some areas of our relationship. And you referred to the border problem being one of them. But the coexistence, therefore, because it's such a complex, such a, variegated relationship in many ways, this coexistence between India and China is also competitive. That may sound like a contradiction in terms, but that's how sometimes human relationships are, and also country-to-country relationships can be. So if China is attempting to reshape the regional order in its image, obviously none of us are really looking at those outcomes. That is not an outcome, not a favored outcome for the Indo-Pacific, not a favored outcome where Japan is concerned, where India is concerned, where Australia is concerned, where many countries in Southeast Asia are concerned. They may not speak so vocally and they may not be as outspoken as some of us are on the issue, but we know where their interests lie. So in a sense, I think we're on the right side of history as far as this is concerned. And China, as it grows in power and influence, I think has also to understand that there are democratic rules that underpin the global order. It can't be my way or the highway,
No, absolutely. And I think that's very important. What you mentioned this, in a way, a balancing act of competitive coexistence, because there's definitely, on the one hand, you have those drivers of grievance, which is the border, clearly kind of came to the fore a few years ago. You have the tech and digital infrastructure, for example, India a couple of years ago banning TikTok, and a number of other kind of competitive areas of competition where, for example, Apple is moving now certain production of iPhones from China to India, and the question, to what extent India can catch up with China in terms of advancements of its IT and software technology and adoption of those. And then there's a question of the trade deficit, which I believe is around 100 billion in terms of in favor of China. So the bilateral trade is very much, if we're talking about using the term of President Trump, that's what he doesn't definitely want to see, which is trade deficits. And India has a very big one with China. So there's definitely a lot of areas of tension. There are development projects, that the new Brahmaputra dam that is being proposed upstream from Indian border, which might affect the ability to farm certain crops and generally the economy in Southeast India. But at the same time, on the other hand,
Northeast India. Northeast
Northeast
India.
India, sorry, of course, Northeast India. But on the other hand, there are areas of convergence, such as, precisely the development in a way in both countries, taking precedence over environmental concerns, talking about dam projects and many infrastructure projects that have taken place in India, for example, some of them, in fact, financed by the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is an entity set up as in a way, a counterweight to the World Bank by China, headquartered in Beijing, where the number one recipients of the funds there is India and Bangladesh. But in terms of volume,
India is also a key member of the bank.
No, exactly. So that's another speaks where there are certain compartments, if we're talking about compartmentalizing the relationship and the coexistence, where there is cooperation, and then others where there is competition. I wanted to ask you about something you spoke about in an interview with Karan Thapar recently, and also wrote an article, which is another potential area of tension, and that is the succession of the Dalai Lama, the head of the Tibetan Buddhism, who is based and has been based for decades in India, and a potential for there to be a conflict when it comes to choosing the successor, and whether it's going to be one appointed by the PRC government in Beijing or by a trust that was set up by the Dalai Lama, and to what extent that might be another, let's say, area of competition, but also tension.
Well, let me talk about, and you've, I think, summed it all perfectly. Let's talk about grievances. Let's talk about convergences in our relationship with China. Now, grievances, especially the border, they're very existential in this relationship. And 2020 military clash that you spoke of at Galwan in eastern Ladakh, high up in the high Himalayas, reminded us that China, at least reminded India, that China is willing to use force to alter facts on the ground. And I think that is a question that still remains to be answered. Why? Why has China sought to be so militarily assertive and, may I say, expansionist? Because the line of actual control between India and China in the border areas had remained relatively tranquil for many decades. There'd been no bloodshed on this line since 1975. So you're talking of 45 years. And then in 2020, the situation erupts. It's like it's this volcano that has become active again. So that is an existential question as far as our relationship with China is concerned. Then, of course, technology is a new frontier of competition. And that's why technology in our foreign policy, and especially in the context of our relations with the West, with the developed West and the United States, is at the core of such relationships. That's certainly something that all of us who work in the field of diplomacy have to learn to deal with, and to be able to understand literally how the currency of technology operates today. And that is a new frontier of competition, especially between India and China. I mean, you have the 5G technologies that we have decided to install and to adopt and to develop on our own without and to the exclusion of any Chinese involvement. And you have the whole developing situation worldwide on artificial intelligence, digital infrastructure, supply chains. All these are areas of divergence with China. So the trade deficit of 100 billion US dollars that you mentioned is not just economic, it's a question of how do we divest ourselves of any strategic dependence, particularly in key areas where national security is involved with China. And yet, of course, there are areas of convergence, development, you're right, economic development, energy security, multilateral finance. You spoke of the AIIB. But even there, I would say convergence as it exists is tactical. It's not strategic convergence. I think we have to draw that distinction. And when it comes to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and in fact, the very, very sensitive question of Himalayan Buddhism, because, we have 1 million Indians who live in the border areas, who practice and who owe their, in many ways, believe in His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who respect him, who worship on the tenets of Tibetan Buddhism, which has become Himalayan Buddhism in many ways. So because of that, India has to be very watchful, very strategically alert to the situation as it evolves on the question of the succession to the 14th Dalai Lama, as and when that situation emerges. So that succession issue could certainly become a point of divergence between India and China, because for China, it's all about sovereignty over Tibet. It's all about control over religious practices. You know very well that in a communist country, religion becomes heavily politicized and controlled. And there is a lot of coercion that is practiced, and in terms of how you control the religious faith and the practices of a people. And for Tibetans, as you know, that is central to their meaning of themselves, of their self-definition, that religion. And that's where China has intervened right into the soul, let us say, of the Tibetan people. And for India, it's a very different approach. Our religious ties, our spiritual ties with the Tibetan people are very, very strong. And in many ways, we've been a custodian, really, of the flame of Tibetan identity over the last 6 decades, since His Holiness took refuge in India after the troubles in Tibet. So it's a civilization and cultural linkage that we have with the Tibetan people. And the way they regard India is very much set on the basis of that definition. Of course, Beijing may attempt to impose its own Dalai Lama, and we'll see what the outcome of that will be, because it definitely will inflame sentiments across the Himalayan arc, as it were, from Ladakh to Arunachal Pradesh. All I talked about the zone of Himalayan Buddhism, our borderlands, which are so important, not only in the terms of political issues concerning our border with China, national security issues, but also our definition, our own self-definition as a very pluralistic, diverse society, which we hold very dear to, and as an article of faith, as an article of definition of ourselves as a nation.
Understood. Thank you for that very thorough explanation. I think another aspect that definitely came to the fore earlier this year was the conflict between India and Pakistan, and definitely was widely reported on in Poland. It was now in April, May, given how, let's say, events and developments accelerate. A lot of people, there were a lot of other events that have since caught attention of the in the public discourse and been debated. But I think it's quite important for us to return to that confrontation and that particular conflict when it comes to India and Pakistan, because it has been defining India for decades, as well as Pakistan. But I think what, and you are alluding to that, in terms of grand strategy, India in a way wants to move away from that being the number one foreign policy priority, as in containing and Pakistan. In a sense, that conflict could be said is putting a obstacle in front of India to move away and engage in this multi-aligned, multifaceted grand strategy that you spoke of. So it could be, forgive me for a reference to a Western pop culture a movie, but in Godfather 3, Al Pacino who's playing Michael Corleone, saying that just when he thought was out of his former, let's say, mode of doing stuff, they brought him back in and he couldn't move to something else. Would you say that the fact that Pakistan continues to pose a security challenge to India, because definitely Pakistan defines itself in opposition to India, and robbing India of that bandwidth that it would other utilize to engage in Eurasia, in the wider in Indian Ocean, what you call, I believe, the India strategic arc. Is it the case that Pakistan has become a distraction that to India's wider ambitions, that kind of stops India from decoupling its international position from Pakistan, again, to quote you, one of your articles? Or, and this could, is also brought up by a number of pundits and scholars, for example, Ramachandra Guha, that actually, it's being to a certain extent for domestic purposes used, the threat from Pakistan, as a rallying around the flag tool by Indian government.
Well, I think the Michael Corleone analogy is very appropriate. I think it's a brilliant way to describe the conundrum that we are looking at as far as India's relations with Pakistan are concerned. And also there's a very tragic symmetry to this, because every time India is looking outward, as you said, towards Eurasia, towards Africa, towards the Indo-Pacific, Pakistan tries to pull us back with an act of terrorism, violence, or provocation. But I believe that India is managing the Pakistan challenge rather than being consumed by it. So you're managing this challenge. And the real shift is psychological. We are de-hyphenating from Pakistan. We have de-hyphenated from Pakistan. Pakistan, to put it succinctly, is no longer the center of our foreign policy solar system. So we've decoupled our global strategy from Pakistan, but terror attacks of the type we saw in April 2025 in Pahalgam, in Jammu and Kashmir, they remind us about the attitude, the venomous approach that Pakistan has adopted to India, and the fact that it continues to pursue terrorism as an instrument of state policy. And I'm not talking about this in a cliched, broken record sort of way. I'm not using that kind of phraseology. Terrorism remains the biggest factor, the threat that we face from Pakistan. And that is what the world has to recognize, has to take seriously. This is not a simple issue. This is a complicated issue, but Pakistan has not jettisoned that approach, which is also why Pakistan is not a normal country. In many ways, it's unfinished. It's, as Salman Rushdie once said, it's an insufficiently imagined country. And that is its tragedy, really. So it remains, of course, this Pakistan relationship from time to time becomes a drain on our strategic bandwidth. And especially as Pakistan grows closer to China, as this latest round of conflict demonstrated very clearly. But I also, yes, as you mentioned, it can generate this whole relationship, or this lack of a relationship with Pakistan, generates domestic political unity, this rallying around the flag tool that you spoke of. But it's strategically limiting for us, definitely. And I think, that is why we're investing our strategic capital outside, beyond this very narrow definition of an India-Pakistan paradigm.
Understood. I want to touch upon, conscious also of time, regarding, what you mentioned earlier, which is the fact that India is a pluralistic society and definitely has been imagined, talking about imagining a country, as under the Nehruvian order as a secular, constitutional, in a sense, united in diversity, if I can use that term, republic. But nowadays, there's a talk that that kind of social contract is no longer in place or is no longer being pursued and protected by the Narendra Modi government and the BJP, who have been in power now, are in power for a third term. If that's the case, and there is obviously a certain shift towards a social contract at home, is this new contract better suited to deliver a strong, prosperous, and modern India, which, some pundits might say is unlikely because really, apart from, let's say, moving towards a majoritarian view domestically, India seems to be lacking a vision of its role and place in the world, apart from, in a way, trying to be recognized as a leading power, which you also alluded to. Or it's just a function of the fact that because of the transformation that has happened over the last decades, and definitely post-1991, where the liberalization of the license Rajas was called at the time, has brought in transformation and prosperity, and the fact that the international environment, international legal order, world order is changing, that requires for that social contract to adapt and change. What kind of is your perspective? We're talking here more about domestic policy, but clearly domestic policy then influences what India would like to achieve, not in the Indo-Pacific, but worldwide.
I think India is definitely in transition. It's a young nation finding its way, seeking its own definitions, and rediscovering itself, if I may say. I know that there are scholars and specialists who have voiced concern about certain changes internally within China. But let me say that the constitution of our country, the constitution that declares us a secular democracy, holds very firm. And the vast majority of Indians continue to believe in the diversity of our society, in the vibrant pluralism that has always marked our social compact within the country. And I believe there is a certain, common sense, if I may say, that prevails when it comes to our approach on a lot of these matters. We self-correct, we restore balance. When you visit India, I know personally that you have a close connection with India, and you realize the day-to-day life in India has its normal rhythms, and people of different faiths and languages and ethnicities and cultural, backgrounds deal with each other. And we're an internally cohesive country. We have continued to remain an internally cohesive country because I live in India and I'm witness to it. And I think our institutions have, by and large, continued to be very robust, and we're respected across the world. And I'm not just talking of the West, which may impose its own definitions and its own, judgmental, let me say, if I may use that word, analyses when it comes to, present day conditions in India. But I am personally, I'm of the belief that our strength as a country rests in our inclusion, in our inclusiveness. It cannot rest on majoritarianism, because we've seen how, for instance, in Sri Lanka, the fallout of that was for that country. So our civilizational identity, and which we keep talking about, Prime Minister Modi keeps saying that the whole world is our family. And that means we respect, the diversity that is, life around us and beyond our borders. So we have to remain open. We have to engage in dialogue, whether it comes internally or externally, whether the needs for that are internal or external. And we will remain a democracy. So I think the outlook, as far as I'm concerned, is positive. and we are growing. We are opening our doors to the outside world, and our horizons today are limitless. I think that really is the India of 2025.
Absolutely. And I think you spoke about India being an omnidirectional country. Now it has the demographic dividend. You spoke about how it's a very young country. Median age is 28 years old. Therefore, India has to ensure that it realizes that youth's rising aspirations and delivers the education, the jobs, the common purpose to its young populace. But at the same time, it also, in terms of Indians pursuing that growth and that ability to prosper, have moved out of the country. And one of the directions that has been more prevalent in recent years is Poland and Central Eastern Europe. In fact, there are tens of thousands of Indian citizens now living, working, studying in Poland. In that context of India being an omnidirectional country, the fact there's a more and more influx of Indian people into the region, into that region of Europe, and the fact that in 2024, India and Poland, during Prime Minister Modi's visit to Poland, signed a strategic partnership. I'd like to ask you, how does India view its relationship with countries like Poland and the region like Central Eastern Europe? What role does it in fact play in statecraft and in that grand strategy that we spoke about?
Well, I think our greatest strength is really that demographic dividend, the vast majority of young people today in India. So it is definitely our demographic moment, if I may say that. And yes, young Indians want jobs, they want to be skilled, they want to be equipped, future ready, as it were, and they want to do it with purpose. They want to do it with dignity. And there's a lot definitely that we have to continue to do on this front as a government, as people working in public policy, public servants, public service. We need educational reform. Of course, the digital infrastructure, digital public infrastructure of the country has grown so phenomenally in the last few years that it is certainly an achievement that is a standout, that I think has been globally recognized. And all that the government is trying to do in this field, I believe, is inclusive. It does not discriminate. There is no discrimination on that front. Everybody, every member of society can take advantage of these new developments. And therefore, we are creating opportunities for our youth. There are challenges to be faced in this regard. I'm not saying that the race is won or that we have completed the journey, but this aspect of dealing with our youth and making them future ready is very much a part of strategic statecraft. It just can't be, a policy here or there. There has to be a large vision, and I believe that's how the government is approaching this.
And in terms of the relationship with region of Central Eastern Europe, is that something that you think is going to continue to be more on the radar of Indian foreign policy?
Well, certainly, I think because Central and Eastern Europe, and including Poland, let me say that, emphasize that, they are critical partners of India in a multipolar world. And that has been our traditional approach, and that continues to be the approach that informs us now in 2025. In fact, our 2024 strategic partnership with Poland reflected this recognition, because the societies in Central and Eastern Europe are societies with a deep historical memory, like India. And what you're trying to do now is to repurpose, your approach to many issues that concern global geopolitics today with strategic clarity. And India and the region, and Poland particularly, share very mutual interests in economic diversification, in technological cooperation. So omnidirectional diplomacy means exactly this, that we engage beyond the traditional G7 or the BRICS boundaries.
Thank you very much. I'd like to finish on a couple of personal questions regarding your career and a kind of your personal perspective. As I mentioned before, you were a high-level representative of the Indian government, Indian Foreign Service during pivotal times, including your involvement in the Sino-Indian relation dating back to the 1980s. You were ambassador to the United States, India's ambassador to the United States during the Obama's pivot to Asia, also during Xi Jinping's rise to the top of the Chinese Communist Party. There is a lot of being said about this deficit of trust between China and India, stemming from the fact that there is very little understanding about each other in the two countries, despite the fact that they're neighbors over a long border. But what do you think, to what extent your work and the work of the people you have mentored, and you mentioned that that's very important to you as well, managed to heal this fracture, to use the title of your book, Fractured Himalaya? There's a way the way to mutual understanding between India and China, through your perspective and your experience, lead through human interactions and through culture, perhaps? Because what I didn't mention at the very beginning is that you are one of the founders, a main founder of South Asian Symphony Orchestra, trying to bridge divides, bridge gaps through love of music, classical music as well. Is that something that resonates with you?
Well, yes, actually, the symphony orchestra that I created was because I've often felt that an orchestra is really a model of society. It's not just a group of people playing music together. It's a very powerful metaphor of what society should be like. Inclusive, everybody plays their role, and everybody has to cooperate with each other. And understand the rules of the game. So there are a lot of metaphorical assumptions here. It was not just about making music, but I think a larger, approach that I've always held very close, and a belief that is very much fundamental to my thinking and my approach to the world. So that's how I created the orchestra. But I wanted to talk about my career in diplomacy, which was a long one. And when I began, in the 70s and the 80s, I was often one of the very few women in the room. Of course, that has changed. That reality has changed. That reality that was the situation then has changed. But it certainly shaped how I worked and how I thought about diplomacy itself, what it excludes, whose voices are amplified, and what assumptions are built into the structures of diplomacy. So I've spoken a lot over the years about the importance of, for want of a better term, a feminist foreign policy, not in the narrow sense of simply adding more women to decision-making positions, though that's absolutely essential, but in rethinking how diplomacy is conducted. Because as women, what we bring to the table is inclusion, empathy, equity, sustainability. These are all issues that concern human society today, that are vital to the approach that we want to follow to build a stronger future. So I think it challenges zero-sum models of power and that have dominated strategic discourse as we've seen it over the decades. And it asks the question that I've often asked: whose security are we actually talking about? Whose voices are at the table? So I think I've tried to highlight issues like climate resilience, access to education, healthcare, digital equity. These are often dismissed as soft, you know what I mean? But I believe they are core strategic priorities today, especially for the global South. And they're building blocks of long-term peace and stability. Today, they are, disproportionately shaped, I believe, by gendered power dynamics. So that's been my approach. And I've also tried to mentor young women in the foreign service, in foreign affairs, outside the Foreign Service also, who work in international affairs. And I'm very happy to see that we have a woman ambassador, Nagma Malik, in Poland today, somebody I've known over the years and I've worked with, and I'm so happy that she occupies this position of significant responsibility today as our country's representative in your country. So that's very, very encouraging. And I think the work of women like her exemplifies the professional excellence that women bring to the diplomatic table. And there's also a quiet transformation that's happening today in Indian diplomacy because of women like Nagma and others in the Foreign Service. So I'm so happy to see women shaping foreign policy today, not just as diplomats, but we see security experts, we see development economists, we see civil society leaders. So we're shifting, I believe, from diplomacy as theater to diplomacy as problem solving. And I think that's a shift the world definitely needs. So just to conclude, since I know that we're running out of time, I'm not talking about exclusion, but I'm talking about human security, which is at the center of all that we do. So every decision that we take as public servants, and diplomacy is a profound form of public service, it has to be anchored in long-term thinking, because we carry the weight of so much responsibility. There's so many human beings on our shoulders when it comes to peace on our borders, the role of our other countries in our, political dynamic, the welfare of our people. So nothing can be short-term. Nothing can be uninformed, because the future is always shaped by how we act today. So the greatest fulfillment for me comes when when a young woman comes up to me and says to me that I had, in a way, inspired her in her choice of studying international relations or becoming a security expert, or an expert on our borderlands, or choosing a career in diplomacy. And I think it reaffirms the purpose of journeys like of women like me. We've tried to open doors. We've tried to build understanding. And now, of course, the torch has passed definitely to a new generation. And they are, I hope, carrying forward those ideals really of service and integrity, of course. And imagine, there is need for imagination. There is need for creativity. And there is need to take risk in all that we do. But ultimately, it turns out to be very worthwhile.
Fantastic. Well, that's a great conclusion to our conversation, Ambassador Rao. I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me and with us today. I believe it's very insightful, extremely thought-provoking conversation that I'm sure our viewers will appreciate. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rafal. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.